Thank you to everyone for being here this evening and for those of you viewing this recording. It's always so wonderful to see so many new and familiar faces joining us. Thank you to my incredible parents, Eddie and Lori, for being the very best and instilling in me to try to be my very best every single day. And thank you to all their survivors, their family members, and guest speakers for sharing their testimonies with us, especially Cynthia Ehrenkrantz, who will be joining us this evening. Welcome to a very special Yom HaShoah program, Seeking Shelter, a memoir of a Jewish girlhood in wartime Britain, featuring Cynthia Ehrenkrantz. My name is Michael Mantell. I'm a psychotherapist, educator, and 3G, a grandchild of Holocaust survivors. In 2020, during the COVID pandemic lockdown, I reached out to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center about hosting a one-time private event for friends and family to honor my grandparents, Alice Diamond and Mickey Mendelovich. We called it Sundays with Survivors, and thank God the program was such a success. So I hosted a second event and a third event, and so on. We continue to add events and opened it up to the public. In 2021, following the success of Sundays with Survivors, we added 2G Tuesdays. These programs has featured dozens of Holocaust survivors and their family members, have reached hundreds of people all over the world, and raised thousands of dollars to support the Holocaust Museum and educational programs. I am grateful that we've been going strong for almost 2.5 years and counting. And most importantly, I am grateful to this community, survivors, their families, and to all of you. This year, we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the establishment of the modern state of Israel. Before we celebrate our independence, starting tonight, we observe Yom HaShoah, which commemorates the 6 million Jews and millions of other victims murdered in the Holocaust. 1 week later is Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Memorial Day for fallen soldiers and victims of terrorism. During the 19th and 20th centuries, the so-called Jewish question was asked: what in the world does the world do with the Jews? The question itself is problematic and underscores not the problem of the Jews, but the problem of anti-Semitic persecution and prejudice and Jew hatred. In the 20th and 21st centuries, a new Jewish question was posed. What do we do with the Jewish state of Israel? This question underscores anti-Zionism and anti-Semitic prejudice and Jew hatred. Sir Ehrlich answered the question very well in a 4-lined poem titled 1 Week Apart, which reads, 2 Memorial Days each year, we calculate the sum, the price of having our own state and the price of having none. If the state of Israel was around during the Holocaust, the fate of the Jews would have been very different. In just a moment, Cynthia will share her story with us. In 1939, when Britain entered World War II, Cynthia was 6 years old. She was 12 in 1945 when the war ended. Seeking Shelter is her vivid child's eye account of life in wartime England as she lived it. An adored only child in a large Jewish family whose comfort existence becomes one of food shortages, gas masks, air raid sirens, and being sent away for months and years at a time to escape German bombing. Contending with bullies and rushing to bomb shelters when sirens wailed, Cynthia finds life hard but good. She shines in a school play, collects foil for the war effort, and celebrates Passover, as we just did. These are the mixed realities of wartime that mark young Cynthia forever in ways that only adult Cynthia can understand. Cynthia started writing stories at age 8, but began publishing only recently after raising 3 children and retiring from a successful career in the specialty food industry. Her work has appeared in gourmet news magazine Simple Cooking, Jewish Post and News, River's Edge, a journal of art and literature, and How Not to Greet Famous People, the best stories from ducks.org. A resident of White Plains, New York, she also performs her work of regional storytelling events and sings with the Yiddish Philharmonic Chorus. Seeking Shelter is her first published book. And 3 days ago, Cynthia just celebrated her 90th birthday. So I'd like to say happy birthday to her. At the end of this program, I invite all of you to ask your questions and share your thoughts during the Q&A portion. Please use the raise hand emoji or unmute yourself, or you can even write your questions and comments in the chat for me to read for you. And before we begin, just a few quick announcements. Many people made donations when they signed up for this program, and I'd like to say thank you. Your generosity helps HMTC educate young people about the history of the Holocaust and its lessons through education and community outreach. If you still like to support HMTC, there's always time for that. I will put a link in the chat for you to make a donation and also in our follow-up email. Also, a few upcoming events. Tomorrow, there is a special screening of 4 Winters, a story of Jewish partisan resistance and bravery in World War II, which will be followed by a talk with director Julia Mintz at the 92nd Street Y. You can attend in person or virtually. The virtual ticket option is for the talk only. And next Sunday, April 23rd, I will be hosting a very special program with the Brotherhood Synagogue 7th grade students as part of their mitzvah project. As an act of remembrance, Brotherhood Synagogue 7th graders are committing this year's mitzvah project to raising awareness and funds for Holocaust education. Please meet us at Brotherhood Synagogue in downtown Manhattan for a community walk around Gramercy Park 6 times. A total of 1.5 miles to commemorate the 6 million Jewish souls, including 1.5 million Jewish children lost in the Holocaust. We will conclude our community event with a talk with Holocaust survivor Alex Constantine, whose testimony will be featured in a documentary, Escape to Nowhere. The money raised will be donated to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center. This in-person program is open to our entire community, so please join us to walk, cheer us on, and listen to Holocaust survivor Alex Constantine, and light refreshments will be available. Lastly, please save the date for the next 2G Tuesdays program, scheduled for Tuesday, May 30th at 6 p.m., when Deborah Stuber, joined by her parents, Holocaust survivors Edith and Kurt Lucher, will share their testimonies. This program will be in person at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center in Glen Cove, Long Island. There will also be a virtual option available as well. Thank you all for being here, for your continued support, and with that, I welcome Cynthia.
Hello. My book is called Seeking Shelter. Because when World War II broke out, my parents were sure that, and as was everybody else in England, we were sure that Hitler was going to invade. And their first priority was that I should be kept safe. So when I was 6, and war broke out on September the 3rd, 1939, within 2 weeks, they sent me to stay with my grandparents who lived in Wales. My grandparents lived in Wales because my grandfather had immigrated there in 1904. He was a house painter, and you might think that Wales is a sort of strange place for Jews to immigrate to, not like Brooklyn or in England, Golders Green, where there was a big Jewish population. But there was a small Landsmannschaft from his town of Plotzk, which is outside of Warsaw. And they told him it was a good place for business because the miners were the population, and they needed all kinds of services. So my grandfather walked up and down the street and the miners' houses, knocking on doors, carrying a bucket of whitewash and a paintbrush, and offering to paint their houses in the springtime. They were thrilled, the miners' wives, because their houses were begrimed with coal dust. The coal miners' villages were all lined with coal dust, and it flew into inside the houses as well as outside. And so that was how he came to Wales. My mother's parents came also from Poland, but from Częstochow, which was a big center for the Catholic religion, because there was a very famous Black virgin there who was paraded out on Easter, and she used to be encrusted with jewels, but she was no longer. And guess who was accused of stealing the jewels? And we all, most of us know that our grandparents would hide their eyes when they passed a church. They certainly would not go inside to steal jewels or anything else. But so they came to London, and my other grandfather came to Wales. So I was sent to stay with my Welsh grandparents. They were Polish, but Polish Welsh, and my grandmother was dying of cancer. I was sent in September. I came back in January. She died in February, and she was in the house. It was not a very nice place for a 6-year-old. Nobody took any notice of me, whereas at home, I had been the center of attention because I was an only child and only grandchild, and everybody thought that I was the best thing since sliced bread. And so I was, and it was a very unhappy time for a little child to be separated from your parents. It's the first time I ever saw my mother cry, and when she had to leave me. And I remember that very vividly, as the tears seemed to spurt out of her eyes. And but that period of World War II in England was called the Phony War, because although we were sure that we were going to be bombed, nothing happened. And so my parents thought they would bring me home, and they did. And I stayed home, and the London Blitz actually started officially in September 1940, when I was 7. But the first air raid of the war was actually in my hometown. And that was in August. My hometown was Croydon, where my parents had moved because it was a very good town for business. And my father had a paint and wallpaper shop. And we were, and it was also the depths of the Depression. When in August, we knew that Croydon was going to be a target because it had the main airport for the British Isles. Croydon Airport, before Heathrow, was the main airport, and we knew that it was going to be attacked. Or I say we, my parents knew. So I'll read you a part of my book, which describes that first air raid from my point of view, as I was 7 at the time.
You have made an interesting impression of George Luca.
Everyone knew that Croydon Aerodrome would be a prime target for German bombers. Even so, the first attack on August 15th, 1940, an event now known as Black Saturday, came as a surprise. I got ready for bed after supper that evening, and Daddy came upstairs to tuck me in. This was a real treat because he spent most nights at the fire station, but tonight he was on leave. He sat on the side of my bed and held my small hand in his big one. I loved the rough feel of the skin on his palms, work-worn from heaving heavy fire hoses. Let's say the Shema, he said, and as was our nightly ritual, we recited the prayer together. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Daddy plumped up my pillow so it felt like a nest around my head. Then he gave me a bristly kiss. "Good night, honey bunch," he said. I listened to the sound of his footsteps going down the stairs. Judy the dog lay beside my bed on the cool linoleum. Though it was only 7 o'clock and still bright outside, my room was dark because my father had drawn the blackout curtains. I turned on the lamp on the wicker table next to my bed. I propped Brenda, my doll, up on the small chair next to the child-sized table with a cup and saucer in front of her from the Snow White tea set Auntie Fan had given me for my 7th birthday 4 months before. Brenda and I had enjoyed a tea party that afternoon. The rest of the tea set was on top of the bookcase. Each cup and saucer and plate was decorated with a character from the Disney animated film. I got up and put Brenda in her pram, covering her with a pink blanket that had been mine when I was a baby. Back in my bed, I couldn't fall asleep, so I pulled a book out from under my pillow. I was just starting to read when the air raid siren went off. We'd had warning drills regularly since the war began. The swooping wail of one factory siren would start a chorus as it was joined by all the sirens in town, making a roller coaster of deafening sound. It was so loud, I stuffed my fingers into my ears and the wailing notes faded away. When the wail died down, I went back to my book, waiting for the usual all clear, the sound of one sweet sustained note that always went off a few minutes after the warning. But this time, there was no all clear. Suddenly, my parents rushed in. "Get up, Cynthia," my father said calmly. "Put on your dressing gown and slippers. Bring your gas mask. This is a real air raid." I pulled my bathrobe out of the wardrobe, grabbed my cardboard gas mask case, threw the string over my shoulder, and followed my parents. "Hurry up, Cynthia. We're going to the closet under the stairs," Mummy said, her voice quivering. When we reached the first landing, I stopped. "I forgot Brenda." "No time for that," Daddy said. "We have to get into the shelter." I could hear Judy's nails clicking on the stairs behind us as we ran down. Government pamphlets had advised us that the safest place in a house to take shelter during an air raid was the ground floor closet under the stairs. Before the war, ours had stored suitcases and steamer trunks. My parents had moved these up to the attic, and now the space held a blow-up mattress, a couple of old blankets, and 2 folding chairs. A cardboard box in one corner held a large flashlight, a box of candles, matches, tin plates and cups, some cans of food, and a can opener. A bucket filled with water stood next to it. A dim light bulb switched on when you pulled a string. The closet was the only room in our house that did not have a mezuzah nailed to the doorpost. The little room had a damp, stale smell, and I held my nose as we entered. Daddy blew up the mattress. I lay down on it, and Mommy covered me with a scratchy blanket. Judy lay down beside me and licked my hand. My parents unfolded the chairs and sat down. "Let's sing 10 green bottles," Mommy said. When we got to 7 green bottles are hanging on the wall, there was a roaring sound of planes in the distance that grew louder and louder. And when we got to 5 green bottles, the deafening noise was directly overhead. Our voices trailed away, and I put my hands over my ears. Then there was an eerie whistling sound, followed by loud, ear-splitting bangs and thuds. The floor shook under us, and Judy started to whimper. I screwed my eyes shut so tight I could see little colored lights behind my eyelids. My stomach turned over and over, and I felt as if I would throw up and have diarrhea all at the same time. I panted little short breaths, just like Judy did when she'd been running. My father always carried a book in his pocket. He sat on his chair, flipping the pages, but not reading. My mother knelt beside me, stroking my hair. "It's all right, darling," she said. Then she lay on the splintery floor next to the mattress and put her arms around me. Daddy stood up. They're bombing the aerodrome, he said. I'm going up to watch the fireworks. Please stay with us, Marcus, Mum pleaded. Let's stay together. But he left saying, back soon, Tilly. I could hear him running up the stairs 2 at a time to our parlor floor. Mommy looked cross and breathed hard through her nose. I buried my face in Judy's silky fur. The thumps and bangs were farther away now. At last they stopped and the all clear sang out. Mum pulled out a cigarette and put it in her mouth unlit. When she spoke, it dangled from her lower lip. Let's go upstairs, she said. I jumped up from the mattress, pushed the cupboard door open, ran up to my room, picked Brenda up and I hugged her. I'm so sorry I left you behind, Brenda, I said. I'll never leave you alone again. As I was leaving the room, I kicked something. A cup from the tea set had fallen off the bookcase and broken. I carried Brenda down to the kitchen where my parents sat at the table, waiting for the kettle to boil for tea. I told them about the broken cup. It must have toppled off the shelf from the vibrations, Daddy said. Don't worry, honey. I'll glue it back together for you. We sat drinking tea while my father told us about the raid he'd watched from the living room window. I saw a real dogfight, he said. The searchlights picked out a German plane, and one of ours sprayed him with bullets till he spiraled to the ground. Daddy made circles in the air with his finger. The attack was front page news in the paper the next morning. My mother read aloud from it. It says, 60 people were killed and more were injured and taken to hospital. Windows were blown out of houses and people on a bus were hit with flying glass. As Mommy held the newspaper up, I could see a photograph on the front page of the wreck of a German airplane. A badly damaged house was behind it, and I wondered what had happened to the people inside. After breakfast, Daddy fastened the metal buttons on his fireman's jacket and got ready to leave. I'm going to get one of those Anderson shelters and put it up in the backyard, he said. It looks as if the war is finally starting. So, Michael?
Hi. Thank you for reading a part of the book. I have it right here. Not sure if it's visible. There you go. Incredible read, as I've shared with Cynthia. I just want to say, first of all, thank you, Cynthia. I mentioned this to Cynthia, but I'll say it to everyone that Cynthia brings this beautiful childhood innocence to her writing. And as it's supposed to be from the perspective of a 6-year-old. One of the perfect illustrations for me of that was in a previous chapter, which Cynthia titles Chicken Farming, when she mentions that all the road signs in Britain were taken down after the Battle of Dunkirk in case of a possible German invasion. And at the time, Cynthia writes that she thought it was a great idea that Britain was doing this because her younger self thought that if a German came to Britain, came to England, and they had to ask their way around, they would be found out by their German accent. So to me, that was so beautifully captured and kind of really talks about the essence of this book, how you bring about your past experiences, writing about it as an adult. Yeah. So maybe I can start by asking just a few questions and then like to open it up for other people to ask. I know this is not our usual Sundays with Survivors program, and that's why we had a different title, because it seems like a perfect way to kind of begin exploring Yom HaShoah from a different perspective. Cynthia, you said that you never meant to write a novel. So I'm curious, and I'm sure everyone else is, what the impetus for writing your book was. And then if you can share what that process was like.
Okay, well, I've always written since I was a child, but never thought anybody would want to read anything particularly that I wrote. But in the 90s, in the early 1990s, I thought I'd like to start to write essays for my children so they should know about my family and know what it was like growing up. At the time, they weren't the least bit interested. They were having their own children. They were walking the floor with babies. But I knew that because I regretted so much not finding out more about my own grandparents, that they would feel differently later on. And I was right, of course. Now that they're middle-aged people, they are very interested. So I enrolled in a class at Sarah Lawrence and started to write what were essays about my family and about being a little girl in growing up in England. And of course, it was wartime. So all kinds of details about the war kept on coming into these pieces that I was writing. And my teacher, Charles Salzberg, kept on saying to me, Cynthia, people don't know about what it was like day to day to live in a war. They know about the battles. They know about Winston Churchill giving speeches, but they don't know what it was like to live with clothes being rationed. How did food rationing work? All of those things. And also the separations of children, which were universal all throughout England, that if you were in a major city like not only London, but Liverpool, Manchester, the children were sent to safe areas. And the evacuation program was tremendously efficiently done over like a 3 or 4 day period, that children were just whisked away out of places where there was going to be a lot of bombing. And so we were very, my parents and all the adults were very aware of the impending danger, and they sought to, and in the book, I've tried to describe what it was like just day to day. And a lot of people have told me that these were details of things that they knew nothing about. Like, how do you put on a gas mask? I mean, that was sort of strange. How did rationing work? And I do have recipes in the book, as Michael told me. Many people who are Holocaust survivors include recipes, but unlike them, I do not recommend that people make these recipes, because the food shortages were terrible. And so I've included recipes that were distributed in government pamphlets to tell you, for instance, we never saw a banana. We didn't know what a banana was except from pictures. And so the one recipe for mac bananas tells you to take parsnips and to mash them and then add artificial banana flavoring to it and a little sugar. You don't want to make that. I mean, it was disgusting. But my mother made it because we were told that it was going to be, the closest thing to a banana. And when I tasted that, I thought, what's all this fuss about bananas? I mean, this is awful. So the book has lots of those kinds of details in.
Yeah, so that was actually one of the questions that I was going to ask you, because I do read about food and recipes in a lot of Holocaust memoirs and books, and I find it very interesting. I mean, for me, I kind of feel like I know why, but I was wondering the importance for you for including that throughout your book. You specifically have them named or who made them previously. So that was definitely something I was curious about, especially because this was sort of your career as well, right? Especially food. Yeah.
Yeah, I ended up in the food business as an adult, and I think that maybe it was promoted by the fact that food was so central to us. Of course, it's central to everybody, especially to Jewish people, but it was so central to our lives as to how to put together a decent meal when food was rationed, and also that the government was very clever in many ways. They told us that the RAF pilots were able to see so well to shoot down planes, German planes, because they ate a lot of carrots. They didn't tell us anything about radar, but they told us that carrots had a lot of vitamin A. It was very good for your eyesight. And so they introduced a cartoon character called Dr. Carrot. And all the children wanted to, well, it wasn't only that we were going to get good eyesight, but anything that was a cartoon, you know, it's just like they sell cereal here today, but instead of selling cereal, they were selling carrots and potatoes, who were also featured in a cartoon. So all the children were clamoring for carrots and potatoes because of these cartoon characters that were in all the advertisements. So that was another aspect of food growing up.
That's another thing I loved in your book. You have these ads that are foreign to me that I'm looking at for the first time. So Dig for Victory, you have all of these chicken or hen waste, and they sound to be very central to your story. So that was kind of like a beautiful kind of a introduction to some of that in your life. You add so much detail to your book. And again, what I love about it is it has this child perspective, but there's also a lot of background information for people like me who wouldn't know what it's like to grow up at that time or in that kind of situation or context. So I appreciated that.
Well, Michael, could you put up the picture of my father in his fireman's uniform?
Yeah. Give me 1 second to pull that up. Yeah, there are a lot of pictures in the book, and I wish we included them. So hold on 1 second. We have a few here. All right.
He's the third one down. That's my parents, and this is my father in his fireman's uniform. At the beginning of the war, my father volunteered for the fire service. One reason to do that was certainly there was a big call for people to volunteer because they knew that bombing was going to take place. But another reason was that if he was in the fire service, he knew he would not be shipped overseas. So at the beginning of the war, the auxiliary firemen, as he was, were looked down on by the regular firemen because that was a reason that that many people volunteered for the fire service to make sure that they would do national service, but they wouldn't be shipped overseas. But of course, when the Blitz began, and later in the flying bombs, they were called to duty to dig people out from rubble, and all that prejudice went away. They got a lot of respect. Another reason I wanted people to know about my father being a fireman was that when I was doing research for the book, I read other memoirs from British people who had grown up at the same time as I did. And one of them was a woman who lived in a seaside town called Southend. And as part of her book, she described how all the Jews lived in huge mansions overseeing the ocean. And that when war broke out, they all left and went to Australia and Canada. And I was so incensed. I had cousins who were in the army, who fought in North Africa and in Europe. And I had other cousins whose house was a direct hit, and all three of them were killed. They had a 1-year-old baby. I mean, this was just not true. My parents did put my name down to send me away to Canada or the United States, as many children were at the beginning of the war. But then one ship there are actually two ships that carried those children were torpedoed. And so they stopped that scheme. But as for adults, Jewish people, I never heard of such a thing. And so that made me think, I need to get this out. I need people to know that my father was a brave man. And so that was part of my reason for writing the book, really.
Thank you for sharing that aspect. So it sounds like there were two reasons why you wrote this book, one for your family, but also for other people to know this other story of the Jewish people, et cetera.
Yes, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that experience? So your family was going to send you overseas, what your knowledge of that was, if you understood that at the time, because I know you speak about it in your book.
Well, what you know, what my mother told me was that it was going to be like a vacation, and I could choose what I was going to take. I couldn't take all my toys, but I could take one thing. And so, of course, I was going to take Brenda, my doll, because she went everywhere with me. And there was one big book that I had, which had a lot of stories in it, including the whole of Alice in Wonderland was in that book. And so those were the two things I decided to take. And my mother told me it was going to be a lot of fun, and I would go on a ship, and it would be like a long holiday, a long vacation. And that is so typical, even though my parents were only first generation Brits. That was the stiff upper lip attitude that everybody had. And I think that is what stood us in such good stead, was that attitude of you would get up in the morning after there'd been a terrible air raid, and there would be rubble all around you, but maybe there was one shop that wasn't touched, and they would have a sign up saying business as usual, we never closed. And I that combined with the sense of unity that there was in the country, that really I think helped us to go through the war and to weather it as well as we did. My friends and people I know who came with kinder transport, I don't know if there's anybody in this audience who was involved with kinder transport, but kinder transport brought 10,000 children from Austria and Germany and Poland to Britain, also unaccompanied. And if you find out what happened to them as adults, the majority of these people became very well adjusted and very successful and went on to have wonderful families. And I think that the stiff upper lip really helped them out. Wonderful movie called Into the Arms of Strangers, which is a testimony from a lot of kinder transport adults. That is, it's a wonderful movie.
At another point in your book, you speak about the time when the communication, letters, and packages from your family in Poland stopped, about your grandmother constantly worrying about the lost communication with her father, brothers, and sister. So how and when did you learn what happened to them, and what was that experience like?
It wasn't, well, they guessed that something was going on. The news of the concentration camps really did not come out fully until the release of them in 1945. And that was when my grandmother finally learned what had happened to all her relatives except for two. And two of them were survivors of Auschwitz. The rest of my grandmother's family, my extended family, were all slaughtered in Auschwitz. One family with 4 children, the 2 survivors told us, were sent to the gas chamber the day before the Americans arrived. So, and then, of course, my grandmother found out, and she was so grief-stricken that all her sisters, her brothers, obviously her parents, who were elderly themselves, but the rest of the family with children were all lost. And that was not really the truth until 1945. The two cousins who survived were put in a DP camp, and it was overseen by General Patton. And General Patton was a well-known anti-Semite, and he hired guards who had been the guards in the concentration camps. So my two cousins escaped one night. They were not supposed to leave, but they escaped, and they remembered my grandparents' address, and they wrote to my family, and we were able to get them to go to us, passage to Australia, where we had other family. So, their families, their descendants are now in Australia.
And throughout your book, you speak about your Jewish religious upbringing, including Shabbat, services on the high holidays, not killing a chicken yourself because kosher laws, reciting Shema Yisrael prayer while anticipating an attack by German bombers, as you read from that excerpt, and going to Catholic school run by nuns. And you also mentioned that your family was the quote unquote typical British Jews. So what was your religious identity, religious Jewish identity, and how has it remained or changed throughout your life?
Well, my parents were 3 day a year shul goers, 2 days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But we kept kosher at home, and they felt very strongly about their own Jewish identity. My mother lit candles. My father made Kiddush on Friday, but they weren't very identified as far as shul membership was concerned. It's interesting that in England, if you want to be buried in a Jewish cemetery, you have to belong to a synagogue. And that, I think that's still so to this day. It was certainly when my mother died. And that was why she kept up synagogue membership, not to go, but so that she would be assured of a burial plot in a Jewish cemetery. In England, there's no separation of church and state. So every school is affiliated with, if it's a state school, which I went to for part of the war, it's affiliated with the Church of England, which is Episcopalian. Every day starts with prayers. And my mother asked that please, not to have me go into prayers, because she didn't want me, praying to Jesus, etc. And so I stood outside all by myself at one point, and then in the school that I finally ended up, there were about 6 Jewish girls, and we stayed outside until they gave out notices at the end of school prayers, and then we would have to walk in to listen to the notices. And I don't know why we couldn't have just gone into the back. We came in the back door, and why we couldn't have sat down in the back cross-legged like the rest of the children. But the rule was that we had to walk to the front. And so we walked. It was like, it was like running the gauntlet. We walked through this long assembly hall, and everybody turned around to look at us as we came in, and we had to sit in the front. I don't know why that was, but only about 8 years ago, I was in England, and my school had a reunion, and that a friend and I went and attended. And here was I, 80 years old, or 80 something, and somebody comes up to me and says, "I remember you. You're Cynthia Ehrenkrantz. You used to come in late to prayers." So that made me, I think, because I didn't come into prayers, then the children would say to me, "Well, why don't you come into prayers then?" And I'd say, "Well, because I'm Jewish and we have different prayers." "Well, what are your prayers then?" And I'd say, "Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad." That's the only Jewish prayer I knew. And then they would say, "Ew, ew, mumbo jumbo, mumbo jumbo." And they would make fun of me. and I encountered a lot of anti-Semitism. I think largely because I was singled out because I didn't go into prayers. But then as a teenager, when I was 13, at the end of the war, I joined the Zionist youth movement, Habonim. And teenage years is when you really form your identity. And that's when I really, I really became strongly Zionist and strongly Jewish. And that has, that's all stayed with me. And I'm grateful for it. It was a hard road to hoe to have to, because of having school prayers. And that's one reason why I'm very much against prayers in school in America, in the United States. I think it's terrible because not only us, but now look at people like Nikki Haley was a Hindu. And why should she have to recite Christian prayers? And the same with Muslims. I think it's, I don't think there's any place for prayer in the public schools. If you want to pray, then you go to a school in your own religion, that's it. I'm very opinionated.
It's good to have opinions.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I asked about what it was like being Jewish, and then you brought up anti-Semitism, which I think is so important because in one way or another, it's part of our Jewish experience. And it's part of the world we live in, and especially the time that you're depicting in your book, right? This is kind of the war happened. I think you even mentioned in your book that someone said that the war was started because of the Jews, right? You had a child in your class, and another, a boy, I believe, was trying to feel if you had horns, right?
Yes.
Which I couldn't believe. And my own experience half a lifetime ago, when I was in college, someone said very nicely, and it was actually, I wouldn't call it anti-Semitic, but when she found out I was Jewish, she says, "Oh, but you don't have horns." And it wasn't come from a place of hatred. It was a place of unknowing, and she thought she met a Jew for the first time. And then I said, "Well, you're friends with my friend so-and-so, and he's Jewish too." And she said, "He's Jewish too?" Like this idea of I didn't realize I met other Jews. So yeah, it's very interesting, just these experiences that we have. You wrote something really beautiful. Again, I can talk about little points in your book. You read an excerpt, so I don't want to keep doing that. But there was one thing that I thought was really beautiful. You said, even though in school and classmates, even though we all wore the same uniform and looked alike, I still felt like an outsider looking in. And that kind of like sums up for me a little bit of this Jewish experience in Britain, especially during this wartime.
So, Michael, if you would put up the Anderson shelter picture. There we go. So after we had the experience of experiencing raids in the cupboard under the stairs, my father built a shelter like this. These shelters were distributed by the government. There was a nominal fee for them, and you had to dig a big pit in your backyard, which he did. And there were sandbags you see on the top, and they were made of corrugated iron. And we did sleep in this kind of shelter at the time of the London Blitz. When the air raids got very bad in Croydon, that was when my mother and I left Croydon and we were evacuated to the country. And then, Michael, if you would put up the Morrison shelter, there. The Anderson shelter was very unpopular because I don't know if you noticed, but in England it rains a lot and it's very damp and it's pretty cold, and sleeping outside was no pleasure. So this shelter was invented, which was basically a cast iron table, and it would substitute for a dining table for many people. And you could open the side and you would sleep inside underneath the cast iron. And if your house was bombed, you were assured of an air pocket because the cast iron was heavy enough to support a huge amount of rubble, etc., on top. And it did save many lives. When we slept in the Morrison shelter, it was during the flying bombs, which were in 1944, long after the Blitz. And it seems to me that when people I talk to in the United States all know a lot about the Blitz, but they don't know that much about the V-1 rockets that started coming in June 1944. And again, Croydon, and they were unmanned missiles. They held over 1,800 pounds of high explosives. They came over day and night. The Blitz, the German planes came over only at night because they were harder to spot in the dark. We had searchlights that spotted them. We had, planes who fought them off, etc. But because they were unmanned missiles, they were they came in daylight all the time. Croydon, which is about the same size as White Plains or Stamford, had, I think it was about 1,800 direct hits from flying bombs. And hundreds and hundreds of people were killed and injured. So I gave Michael a clip of what a flying bomb was like. If you could get this is what it looked like, okay? And we call them doodle bugs or buzz bombs. And if you could bring up the clip that has the sound on it. A flying bomb, while you heard, it was called a buzz bomb because it sounded a little bit like a very loud, a very loud motorcycle. And while you heard it, it was fine. But when the sound cut out, you knew that was when it was going to fall. You had about 30 seconds or maybe a little bit more of its own volition. It would carry on going and then it would just fall. And my mother and I describe us being caught in a flying bomb attack. So go for it, Michael. This is what it sounded like. And you'll have to, you should make your sound on your computer, bring up the volume as loud as you can. That silence was the time in the war when I was the most terrified. I was old enough to understand what was going on because I was 11 by that time. When you're a little child, you know, your parents can tell you a lot of stories. But by the time you're 11, you can listen to the news, you can read the newspaper, and you have much closer to an adult experience. So I wanted people to just feel what it was like to listen to that noise coming closer and closer, and then the dead silence before it fell. So that was right towards the end of the war. That was Hitler's secret weapon in June 1944. We were lucky to survive, I'd say.
Yeah, I think there's you mentioned a point in your book where there's devastation in your hometown.
Yes,
with this, yeah, which is very super close to home, not just physically, but how it endangered the family, et cetera.
yes, yeah.
What kind of research did you have to do, because you were young at the time? So what kind of research did you have to do to fill in the blanks and details to make the
Well,
story more accurate to?
Well, I read other people's memoirs. I did that. I also, I read Winston Churchill's accounts. I went to England. I was in while my mother was living, I would go to England, a couple of times a year. So I went to England, and I went to Churchill's war rooms in Whitehall, which, if you have a chance to go to London, I recommend for anybody. It's living history. But then I spent a summer in the Croydon Library looking up newspaper accounts of the time. I wanted to be able to have the dates to be accurate and to mesh with things that I remembered. And it was interesting that things that I remembered, I was able to pinpoint the actual days when they happened. So I did that in the Croydon Library, and I had also friends who were contemporaries of mine who had similar experiences to mine. Mostly being sent away. That was what I think that's what resonated with us as being very young kids, being separated from your parents. I think that was hard. I was lucky because when we went away from the Blitz, my mother came too, so I was not separated from her then. But we moved to a village in the country to be away from the bombing.
And you talk about kind of like a moment of PTSD, just because you're bringing it up. So I'm just wondering, when hearing loud noises, I mean, what was that experience like after the war?
Factory sirens will go off. In some cities. There are none near me where I live now. But in some cities where there are factories that break for lunch, or it's the end of the workday, and when those sirens go off, when I've been in one of those places, I can tell you that the bottom of my stomach still drops out. And my friends will say the same thing. That has gone on our whole lives. And I wanted, I think in writing the book and in publishing it, I wanted people to know what it was like to be a little child, because war is always with us. And particularly now, when we read about what's going on in Ukraine, but we can't have, however vivid the television depictions are, it's not the same as being there. And so I wanted people to have some feeling of what it's like to be a child growing up in the war. And so I hope I succeeded.
I hope people read the book, because you really captured it. It was very easy to read, and I felt myself getting immersed in the chapters and learning things that I didn't know about before. So yeah, I think it's a beautiful read. And again, just the child perspective, you're seeing everything with innocence, and it's kind of like cute and whimsical, but there's so much going on around you. So that led me to ask that question of,
And
going back to it as an adult.
It's on Amazon, but it's also, you can order it from your local bookstore, which I like to support bookstores, because they have had such a struggle with Amazon coming and taking everything over. And so if you have a chance to order from bookstore, that would be great.
And I want to be mindful of the time. If anyone has any questions or comments, if they want to either put their hand emoji to raise their hand, they can unmute themselves. I think, DJ, you have your hand raised, so please.
Yeah, I don't know where the hand emoji is.
That's
I have to
totally
use my
fine.
real-
I
my
can
real
see you,
hand.
and it's great. I like the in-person hand, so I'm having you use that first. So by all means.
Well, thank you for Michael. You've done a beautiful job with this interview. But Cynthia, if I may address you with that informality, I want to thank you so much for sharing the poignancy of those tender years, and thank you for the strength that you survived. You know, I realize it's about your youth, but I'm kind of dangling. When did you leave England? Like, very briefly, I know it's about your youth, but what brought you here?
Oh, love brought me here. I met my husband in Hillel House, and I said to my children, go to Hillel House, it's good. And because I came out with a wonderful person. So and I came here in 1957. We got married in 1957. Ezra was in the army. He was in ROTC in college, and so he was a second lieutenant and then a first lieutenant in the army.
So you were in England until that time?
Until then, yes. But I met him in London. Yes.
If I may just make two other, one is a comment, and that is there's also another film I would recommend if you're familiar with the Windermere Children on PBS.
Oh yes.
Yes. That was a very moving film.
Another movie that is fiction, but is very similar to my childhood, is called Hope and Glory, and it's told from the point of view of a little boy. Very good movie about England during the war.
Yeah. One last thing. What is the painting behind you?
Oh, my husband did that. It's a painting that he did after he was came back to the States. He was in England for 2 years, and in the summer, between the 2 years, he came back, and he was on the Queen Mary, and so it's a depiction of the deck of the Queen Mary. So it's like a marriage of, you know, it's a British ship and and painted by an American. Yeah.
Okay, well, then again, thank you, and stay well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, DJ. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? And in the meantime, while people think, I did want to ask Cynthia, because I read the book. You talk about just this idea, you make a comparison, but your adopted country is divided and longing for unity, that you're longing for unity of wartime Britain when everyone had to share and sacrifice. So just as a way to kind of like tie that up, what are the lessons here from that time to now?
Well, I don't know if it's a lesson or if it's just a national ethos is very different. I mean, America is the land of the individual, and England was when I was growing up, particularly at that time, but even afterwards, patriotism was a given. And starting with the Vietnam War here, that was when I think the divisions that I was conscious of came about. And this country is huge also, whereas England's a small place, or Great Britain altogether is a tiny place compared to this enormous country. And it's hard to unite a country of this size, I think. But I remember how, how we really believed everything that the government told us. Now, that was probably wrong, but they were probably lying to us a lot of the time or keeping things a secret. We had no suspicions like that. We had faith in their looking after our best interests. Maybe that was ill-founded, but in this country, people, particularly since President Reagan, they look on the government with suspicion. Remember, Reagan said, if somebody says that I'm from the government and I'm here to help you, beware. And I felt so sad because while there may be some truth in that, on the one hand, on the other hand, government is important and it's necessary. We don't want to be a kind of free-for-all place. So but that's all my personal opinion.
Thank you. And Ellen.
Oh, yeah, hi. I just wanted to thank you, Cynthia, and I just had a question, because I'm also like a childless survivor. I mean, even though I wasn't in the war, but I just wanted to know if you felt like your parents sort of became children. Like, how did they change after this experience? Did you feel more like you were the parent to them after the war? Were they more like scared for you? And that's
No. Well, and it's strange, but the war, the years of the war were the high point of my parents' marriage. They were, I mean, they really loved one another, and nobody had any money. And so that was, and because nobody had any money and they didn't have any money, it was fine. But after the war, my parents quarreled about money all the time and they got divorced. So I lost track of my father altogether. He disappeared. And which when I was writing the book, I realized this was, as an adult, how resourceful he was, how smart he was. But they had totally different attitudes towards money, and never the twain shall meet. If one person believes that you should pay your bills before they come in the mail, and the other person believes that the world owes him a living and he doesn't have to pay back any debts, they're doomed. So they were, so the war was the happiest time of their marriage. And certainly, and no, I don't think that I became a caregiver for my mother, not until she was quite elderly. She was a very independent woman. Yeah.
Thank you. And Ellen, thank you for sharing that and that question, because I think a lot of us growing up in 2G and 3G, we have similar experiences and also kind of wondering if other people have experienced these things as well. So it's incredible to hear just the differences. Yeah. Any other questions, comments, or thoughts that anyone has? All right, beautiful. This was an incredible evening. I got to be introduced to Cynthia through Andrea Bollender, and we had a connection, spoke, I read your book, I loved it. I told Cynthia before I read it, I said, you wrote this book, that's awesome, let's do a talk, and you said, read the book first. And it exceeded my expectations. So it was wonderful. And I just want to point out, there were so many little nuggets, these details. I'll keep going back to that. This idea of, eating healthy versus eating kosher, and what was important during the war, the moments of throwing away these colored pencils. They're just these little moments. I'm just bringing them up. So when people read the book, they'll remember it and go to it. And picking hard candies over chocolate because they'll melt in your mouth faster, and wanting to hold on to that flavor. I mean, there were some of these little moments that you bring up that really transport the reader to the time and place. I thought it was so beautiful. And again, this just childhood perspective, and having a chance to speak with you now, going back to those times, I think that's also a beautiful thing.
Well, it's a pleasure to have met you, Michael.
Yeah.
I hope that we will be together again on other occasions.
I believe we will. Yeah.
And thank you very much for inviting me. And I wish everybody a wonderful spring. And thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Cynthia. And thank you, everyone, for being here, for being part of this program. It's really wonderful. Have a good night, good evening. Take care.